Good afternoon. I'm Jim Turk, Director of the Center for Free Expression at Toronto Metropolitan University, and I'd like to welcome you to today's conversation, the first event that we're having in the 2023-2024 academic year. Today, we're going to be talking about what to do about foreign interference in Canada, an issue that's taken on pretty dramatic visibility in the last 2 days. But before that, I want to begin by acknowledging that the territory on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations: the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As well, I'd like to thank PEN Canada, which is a co-sponsor of today's event. Foreign interference in Canada and in Canadian affairs has become an increasingly serious issue. Despite Monday's dramatic announcement by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that there's strong evidence that agents of the government of India murdered a Canadian Sikh leader on Canadian soil, most of the concern about foreign interference has been focused on China, as Canada and the US are increasingly party to a reemergence of a Cold War of the sort we had with the Soviet Union many years ago, and this time, though, with China. There are very good reasons for concern about foreign interference, very good reasons, but there are also concerns about how the government of Canada is planning to deal with the issue. And that's going to be the topic of today's conversation. Our featured guest is Senator Pau Woo. Born in Malaysia, raised in Singapore, educated in Singapore, the US, Canada, and England, Pau was appointed to the Senate of Canada in 2016. Prior to being appointed, Senator Woo had been president of HQ Vancouver, a public-private partnership that promotes British Columbia as a location for the head offices of international corporations. He also had been president and CEO of Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, chair of the board of the Vancouver Academy of Music, and had sat on the boards of the Public Policy Forum, the Mosaic Institute, and the Canadian Ditchley Foundation. And he, before that, was a senior fellow in public policy at the Asian Institute of Research at the University of British Columbia. In 2012, Senator Woo was honored with the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Award for his contributions to Canada-Asia relations. Welcome, Senator Woo. Senator Woo is going to be in conversation with Meghan McDermott. Meghan is the policy director for the BC Civil Liberties Association. She has a BA in philosophy from Concordia University, law degrees from the University of Victoria, and from the University of Edinburgh. She worked for many years as an advisor with the government of British Columbia, developing environmental and health policy and legislation. She's provided legal services to the government of Ontario and had interned as a legal analyst with the Dullah Omar Institute for Constitutional Law, Governance, and Human Rights in South Africa. Welcome, Meghan.
Hi, it's so nice to be here, Jim.
Now, the format for today's event is going to be a conversation between our two guests. The audience, we want you to be able to participate in that conversation. So we're using a special version of Zoom in which, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And at any point, as you're listening to the conversation that's going on, you have a question that you would like to ask Senator Woo or to Meghan McDermott, you can just write out the question. So click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just write out the question. And after about 45, 50 minutes of their conversation, Meghan is going to turn to the audience and she's going to ask Ange Holmes, the coordinator of the center who's monitoring the questions coming in, to read the first question, which she will do, and then they will respond and we'll go to subsequent questions. So please, I really encourage the audience, as questions come up as you listen to the conversation, write them down on the Q&A spot, And the panelists will get to that when we come to that section of the program. So I think that's it. Over to the two of you.
Excellent. It's so nice to be here with you, Senator. I thought that we'd start, well, I really wanted to start with acknowledging that we're in the midst of, well, a lot of interesting public conversations, but that also there's been a really well-documented spike in recent years of anti-Asian hate and discrimination and racism. We've seen this even here, well documented in BC with the final report that was tendered this year by our BC Human Rights Commissioner, looking into hate during the pandemic. And it did a deep dive into the specifics of the hate and discrimination suffered by the Asian communities here in British Columbia. So I was hoping that you could share your insights about and your experiences about this increase in discrimination that communities are facing across Canada. And if you have any ideas about the reasons for such.
Senator Woo, your audio is not working. You may have to select your.
How is that now? I think it's okay. Megan, it's a pleasure to be in this conversation with you. I want to thank Jim and Ange and the other organizers for putting on this conversation. Your initial question is a very good one because it is something that all Canadians, I think, pretty much agree on, that there has been a spike in anti-Asian racism the last number of years. You know, Statistics Canada put out a report just a couple of weeks ago which found that the number of Chinese Canadians who experienced discrimination and racism doubled in the period between 2014 and 2019. Now, this is 2019, just before COVID. And I think there is recognition that the spike in anti-Asian sentiment, including anti-Chinese sentiment, has gone even higher since that time. In fact, I recall about 2 years ago, an article in Bloomberg about our province, we're both from British Columbia, Megan, describing Vancouver as the anti-Asian hate capital of North America. That was an extraordinary statement made by a foreign newspaper about a place we both love and live in, and which I had thought was a very tolerant and a welcoming place for Asians, despite its dark history. But there you have it. We have a spike in anti-Asian racism, and you asked the right question. It's important not just to recognize that there has been this spike. It's important to figure out what caused it. And I don't think we have yet had the national conversation on the roots of the spike in anti-Asian and particularly anti-Chinese racism and discrimination.
Yes, I certainly hear you. Some of the work that my organization, the BC CLA, does is to think about national security, and I've noticed even in those circles in recent years, there's so much rhetoric going on and fear and paranoia about China in particular. I can understand how that would flow or signal to the populace. If our institutions are concerned about particular countries or foreign states, it's really important for us as a country to figure out how that then flows and can impact communities and how we relate to one another and our neighbors and our friends in everyday life. And I also want to point out that, Canada has a lot of ideas about itself. There's this notion of Canadian exceptionalism. We like to think that we're better than the Americans and that we don't have the the racism that's as virulent and as obvious south of our border. Canadians are good at talking about racism in another time, another place, as I mentioned with the US. However, racism itself can change over time, right? That we can talk about it in the past. We can talk about, the Chinese Exclusion Act from 100 years ago that now our leaders are able to say was a shameful moment in our history. Now, you've been quite vocal in your opposition to some of these proposals that our government's making about foreign interference. And in your opposition, we've noticed that that you're, making a link and drawing parallels between what happened about 100 years ago in this country and about now, what's rearing its head now. Can you tell us more about why you're drawing these comparisons?
Yeah, sure. You make some excellent points. I want to pick up on the first point, though, before I get to the Chinese Exclusion Act. You have properly identified, I think, the most significant driver of the recent spike in anti-Asian racism, and it is xenophobia, or more generally, anti-China sentiment. Now, I want to be very clear. It's not racist to be critical of China, okay? There are lots of things that Canadians are understandably wary of and object to that are going on in China. And to be critical of China as such is not discriminatory or racist. But the spike in anti-China sentiment has been morphed and has been talked by racists themselves as a cover and an excuse to act out their racist sentiments. And the broader feeling of fear of China has emboldened and allowed our security agencies, our politicians, to put in place policies and ideas and to just float notions that are stigmatizing for Chinese people. So it's really important, even as we appreciate that there is a spike in anti-Asian racism, we will do nothing to solve that problem if we don't identify the source of this racism. And you're quite right that it's very comforting for Canadians to assume that our dark past and experience with racism will not repeat itself today, and that the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act is simply something to remember and lament, but not really anything to worry about for the present context. But the insidious thing about racism is that it never appears in exactly the same context, right? And if we were to fight racism only in the form that we saw 20 years or 50 years or 100 years ago, there would be very little to fight, in a sense, because racists and people who are bigots and who are prone to discrimination will find new ways of stigmatizing and new ways of acting out their racism. And I feel we're in that period today. So while we are not talking about a repeat of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 100 years ago, I think we're witnessing what I call modern forms of exclusion. I'm happy to go into that a little further in our conversation, but the crux of this modern exclusion is that it divides Chinese people into those who are acceptable and those who are not. And the criteria for an acceptable Chinese person and an unacceptable Chinese person basically boils down to where you come from, who you associate with, and what your views are. And I think we would all agree that these are not appropriate criteria for any kind of singling out in our society.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. So, excellent points. And let's talk about foreign interference. Let's try to meet what this problem is head on. So there's a lot of media attention, as Jim said, even in the past few days, with the announcement that the death of Hardeep Singh Najjar, Sikh leader here in the Lower Mainland of the British Columbia, was actually an assassination that a foreign state was involved in. That's an obvious example of foreign interference, but like, what are the other issues? What are these? To me, it's a bit of a nebulous issue, right? Because I mean, we're always, I mean, we've always been subject to American influence a lot. There's a lot of European influence. So what is this idea, you know, that when this influence or foreign influence becomes interference and is somehow something that we should fear and that we need to have criminal sanctions about? Can you help us understand this?
Sure. You've used two terms somewhat interchangeably. I know you don't intend to do so, but there's the term foreign interference, and then there's foreign influence. The proposed bill that we are talking about is a foreign influence transparency bill. But when you read the government's consultation paper, the intent of having this bill is to deal with foreign interference. So the government itself tries to conflate the two issues. In a way, the appalling murder of a Sikh leader in Canada is a good way to focus our minds on how to address the issue, because everyone will agree that the assassination, the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil, no less, is abhorrent and has to be condemned in the strongest possible terms. This is if, in fact, India was involved or any foreign state was involved in his assassination. This is an egregious form of foreign interference. Then you have to ask your question, how could we have prevented it? Or how could we prevent future occurrences of this kind of egregious foreign interference? And I'm hard-pressed to understand how a foreign influence registry, which is the solution put forward by the government and indeed by the opposition and many MPs, how that mechanism would do anything to address this concrete example of foreign interference. Indeed, when we look at the recent reports of what are deemed to be harmful foreign interference, what we know is that they refer to not murder as such, but they refer to harassment, they refer to threats, they refer to bullying, and so on. And again, one should be absolutely against these kinds of acts, whether perpetrated by Canadians or by foreigners. But to the extent that these are the problems we're trying to solve, harassment, threatening actions, bullying, stalking, those kinds of things, again, it's not clear to me that a foreign influence registry would do anything to reduce those kinds of acts. In fact, we have a criminal code that already outlaws harassment and threatening behavior and bullying and so on. And I would encourage the government and all of us to think about how, if we're really concerned about those kinds of actions, how we can look at the criminal code as a possible solution rather than bringing forward a mechanism that not only will not solve real foreign interference, but could create a lot more harm.
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot, even from putting myself in the shoes of people even in government who might be involved with crafting this law. Of course, you know, it'd be, if we had something concrete to sink our teeth into. We haven't seen a bill yet about this, and probably won't now for a while because of the inquiry that's been announced. But just kind of imagining what it's like to get these instructions from government, that this is what's being proposed, without having a clearly defined problem that it's going to be able to get at, right? Like you say, we might already have, or we have legal tools, we have the criminal code to get at issues of, intimidation, harassment, murder. And so to create a whole new registry that might then be publicly accessible. It seems like it would be, that people can then check on, and it might arouse suspicion amongst society. At first, it kind of seemed like maybe it's just a case of over-regulation, or like just poor regulation, duplicity, something like that, more red tape. But then when we turn our minds to, like you say, a lot could go wrong. It's not just more red tape, right? That this could be, if it is enacted, it would actually have like important impacts to things that are very important to us to be able to thrive as a society and a culture. So, like, I'm a human rights advocate, civil liberties advocate. We care a lot about free expression, freedom of assembly, and the ability to have these without any kind of fear, without having people surveil us, check in on us, having to register somewhere. I'm having a hard time when I look at the government proposal. While it's saying it seems to be over promising too. It seems to be, this panacea that if we just follow what our allied states, for instance, the ones that they keep pointing to that already have mechanisms like this or are creating them right now as we speak, as with the United Kingdom. But the United States and Australia have something like this. And this is something that proponents of this keep pointing towards and saying, well, look, we just have to have these great tools like our allies do. But I'm having a hard time parsing out how they would actually be able to create this kind of registry, the surveillance registry, without having the chilling effects and the impacts on our liberties and freedoms, how we think, how we express ourselves. The consultation paper keeps saying over and over again that any law that comes out would obviously respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms here in Canada. But again, when I think about being, inside a legal services branch in government, it's just it's really hard what's being proposed, and to trust that something so fundamental, a public registry where we can look one another up to see who might be affiliated and who's a foreign principal. I'm just having a really hard time trusting that this is the kind of tool that they're telling us it can be.
And so am I. And one has to ask why we're going in this direction. What's the impetus and the momentum and the almost uniform political consensus around the need for some kind of foreign agent registry. I'm a rather lonely voice, if I can put it that way, in the Parliament in asking questions about whether this will work. And I have a couple of explanations, and then I'll get into some of the other points you raised. The first point is that there's a geopolitical dimension to this whole discussion. We are in a world of geopolitical contest between the United States and China in particular. And there is a heightened security awareness and anxiety, particularly in Western countries, driven in part by the geopolitical contest. And this is something that many of our leaders have bought into, and our security establishment has, how do I say, capitalize on is perhaps not the right word, but we are giving a lot more license, let's put it this way, to our security and intelligence agencies, and kind of taking their word at face value around the threats that they tell us we are facing. But they are very cagey about what these threats actually are, which is why we have this proposed bill that doesn't actually talk about what the real threats and dangers are, but talks about influences. And it's one thing to say we have to do more to stop the foreign states assassinating Canadian citizens. That's a very concrete thing that we can focus on. Or we have to work much harder in prosecuting foreign agents from intimidating our MPs or intimidating members of the diaspora and so on. Those are concrete things that we can get our head around and which I personally feel we already have the tools to manage. But I sense that we are going in the direction of a foreign influence transparency registry because it is the easiest thing to reach for. It makes us feel like we're doing something, even if we know it isn't doing very much. And it plays both politically and it plays in the broader discussion around the challenge between democracies and autocracies. It all fits a narrative. I don't disagree that there is a real threat to democracy today, but we have to be careful to not use the wrong reasons for pursuing policies which actually harm Canadians.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you're saying and all those values and principles that should be upfront and grounding this conversation rather than, just reaching for a low-hanging fruit and expecting it to be a silver bullet when really, as we say, there can be so many impacts. So let's try to, let's tease some of these out, for instance, to think about why we're hesitant about this and how it could have trickle-down effects to the everyday person or to everyday organizations or just, people that are unaware about how it might impact them. Now, of course, we don't have a bill to look at, but we do have the consultation paper and we know how the registries have been working in other countries too, are the allied countries like the United States, the UK and Australia, and some of the concerns that have been expressed there. And one of them, for instance, one that really disturbs me is the idea of, the activities that you must register are communications activity. And these are communications that aren't directed at the government, right? So they're just general communications to the public that could be captured here. And when we think about communications to the government, that's kind of the more traditional lobbying. That's what people would think of as lobbying, like you're advocating to government, right? So where this departs and really is concerning is this idea that communications just amongst ourselves and in society could end up attracting the need to register and to have obligations under a proposed act. And also that the government could, ask for more information. So if we look into some of these communications activities, I keep putting myself trying to think about how it could impact, somebody like me. And I'm, when I was in university, I was always really interested in human rights and was involved in lots of student groups who, I went to see a lot of speakers from other countries, people who were part of liberation and freedom movements from foreign states that were probably affiliated with political groups that, my reading of this proposal is that even those kinds of activities or even an NGO putting on a talk by somebody from another country just talking about politics could attract this kind of regulation. And that's just really, frankly, scary in that one, I know a lot of people aren't as comfortable as others with, putting their hand up and saying, I'm involved in political discourse and I'm okay to be on the government's radar. And I don't mind being in a registry that everybody can see my name in, right? So first of all, it would just have a chilling effect. A lot of people just might think twice about doing something because they're not sure if they would need to register or not. And if the threat is a criminal sanction, right? Like there's a lot at stake there.
It's inevitable that there will be a chilling effect. And It's not just that communications activities are likely to be covered in this proposed bill. By the way, there's a private member's bill already in the Senate that seems to be a foreign agent registry, and there was a failed private member's bill in the House in the previous parliament. So we have some examples of what it might look like. But it isn't simply that communications activities are covered, and you're right to say they are part and parcel of how we live in society, right? It is also that foreign influence is likely to be deemed to have happened and to be present if you have links, okay, links to a foreign government. That's a very, very vague term, and it can be abused in many ways, depending on the mood of the enforcement agency. But I would add two things here. The first is that while this is about foreign influence based on links to a foreign government, it almost certainly is going to be a function not just of your links or your communication activities, but about the message or the substance of what you are advocating. And it is highly unlikely, in my view, that even if you are a bona fide agent or someone who's influenced by a foreign government, but your view, your position is one that is mainstream or acceptable or very favorable to the Canadian government, it is highly unlikely that you would be targeted for registration. So what this likely bill will amount to is that it will be a registry of people deemed to have links with a foreign government, holding views that are deemed to be unacceptable. It's a registry of un-Canadian views. And I'll just give you a very concrete example of why we should be wary of following, say, the American example. You know, the Americans call it the FARA, the Foreign Agent Registry Act. It was set up in the late 30s as an anti-communist, anti-fascist tool. Good intentions, profoundly abused in the 40s and 50s and 60s. In the 50s, the civil rights activist W.E.B. Du Bois was forced to register because he circulated a pamphlet from France on anti-nuclear activities. And the link they made is that he was circulating material coming from another country, thereby making him an agent of that state.
Yeah, and that's just a civil rights activist trying to be part of society and espousing his views about nuclear proliferation at the time, right? And nuclear
That's
energy.
Right.
So yeah, I can easily see how somebody with strong opinions who are really, involved in community relations and how the world works, how they could run afoul of this, particularly if, it seemed to be un-Canadian or not the dominant thinking. And so I guess another thing that we could, well, for me, that's something that I question, I was curious about your perspective on it, is something that proponents of this proposed scheme are talking about is that, oh, don't worry, it'll be equitably administered in that there won't be some foreign states that are more focused on than others. There won't be members of particular diasporas that will be more important, or that enforcement will pay more attention to than others. And we're being told that, no, it won't be administered in a discriminatory manner. Trust us, we're Canadian government. But it's hard, living just as a human and seeing the way the world works and the way that states fall in and out of favor with other states, that this instrument won't be used. And so I mean, your example of the American FARA, I think, is a perfect example, with the focus on, the Soviet Union for so long, to the exclusion of other foreign states that might have been interfering. Do you share these same concerns with me?
Yeah, I do, and there are two aspects to it. The first is the belief that the registry will not be abused because, look, our officials are sensible, they've got common sense, they're not going to make an extreme interpretation of the bill so that they would sweep hundreds of thousands of Canadians. That's a standard defense of the registry. And it's possible, Megan, that in a different world, in a more benign environment where there aren't these very fraught geopolitical tensions, where there isn't this pervasive fear of China, and where there isn't this heightened security awareness in our country now, it's possible in a much more benign environment, such a registry would be relatively harmless. And in some ways, FARA was not used very much for a number of decades after the McCarthy period, because basically it wasn't seen as necessary. But the problem, of course, is when the time comes, when you've got a heightened political fever around real or perceived threats in society, when there are politicians who will want to weaponize national security as a way of winning votes, when nativists and, xenophobic and latent racist sentiments start to emerge again in society, and they use the registry as a way to act out these sentiments, then we're in trouble, which is why we cannot just say trust the system to be moderate in the application of the registry. We have to think about the worst case scenario, and unfortunately, we're actually in a situation now where it's pretty fraught. On the question of coverage, for sure, it should be country blind and region blind. It boggles the mind, that we would think that the most dominant types of foreign interference or foreign influence in our country that materially affect our politics and economics comes from outside of this continent itself. I mean, it's like, how can anybody not realize that? And yet, that's the world we're in. The inquiry that has just been launched singles out Russia and China. They should be covered for sure. But all of a sudden now people are talking about India, right? But it wasn't in the list before. So it's all a matter of the political winds and who we consider to be the current enemy, whose influence we might be comfortable with and therefore don't want to single out, and whose influence we're not comfortable with and therefore want to single out. That's not a good way to do public policy.
Right. Yeah, it's not nice. I've also been concerned about how it could undermine our own credibility when we, when Canada and our officials want to speak to other more, autocratic states about the way that they treat their own citizens and their own approach to rights and freedoms. Seeing if a law like this is enacted, and it seems, given the momentum, that that's the direction we're headed in, the impacts on our own credibility when we try to point fingers at others and ask for others to live up to the standards that we like.
Do unto others what you would want others to do unto you. There was an article in Global News a couple of months ago talking about Chinese foreign interference in our elections. And from what I can make out from the story, the alleged foreign interference is that some Chinese agents, unnamed, were trying to get a higher turnout of Chinese Canadians to vote in that election. That was the alleged foreign interference. Now, just think about that for a minute, okay? Of course, I don't really want a foreign government to be encouraging Canadians to vote, but on the other hand, voter turnout among the Chinese communities in this country is very low, and I'm kind of happy if somebody is saying get out there to vote, not how you should vote, but get out there to vote. And if you think about it, that's what we do. That's what we do around the world, because democracy, advocacy is a core part of our foreign policy. We don't interfere in foreign elections in the sense that we would consider interference, but we promote democratic elections. We send election monitors. We help civil society understand their electoral processes so that they have a more robust democracy. Isn't it somewhat ironic that if in fact this is true, that we will identify an effort to increase voter turnout in Canada as an example of malign foreign interference?
Yeah, at least the way that the proposal that I have access to reads now, I think it would really make us hypocrites and tarnish our reputation. And I'm curious a bit about how, you were talking about the geopolitical context, and it reminds me of, well, in my mind, I'm kind of drawing comparisons to it's quite a different thing. But for instance, the no-fly list, which was a byproduct of the war on terror from about 20 years ago. And then my understanding of our approach to the no-fly list, again, was we were kind of being bullied into it by some of our allies who have more power than us. And I think that you've mentioned this a bit about, talking specifically about the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes are like this intelligence community, the UK, Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. And in a letter that you had written to the previous public safety minister, you had urged Canada to maybe take the approach or to slow down a bit like New Zealand. Do you have any updates about that, or about your thinking on that?
Well, the point you made is very important. The advocates of this registry often say, we should do it because the Americans do it and the Australians do it. Now, that's not a good reason to do something. We're not America, we're not Australia. Besides, there are many problems with FARA in Australia and what they call the FITs in Australia. It would be a mistake for us to have a registry simply because they have one. The reason why we should not be following the example is because we're different from Australia and the United States. We like to pride ourselves as being a country of immigrants and that we value multiculturalism. The definition of being a country of immigrants is that we value foreign influences. We can't be a country of immigration simply for the labor power that immigrants bring here, right? Or the money that they bring here. We come as a package. I'm an immigrant. We have so many immigrants. And they come as a package of skills, of knowledge, of labor power, wealth or no wealth, but they come with views as well. And surely the whole idea that we are a country of immigrants has to incorporate the notion that we also welcome these foreign influences, which is why just the notion that we would have a registry of foreign influence is so dissonant to what I understand of the Canadian psyche and why we should not go in that direction. You mentioned New Zealand. I don't have the latest updates, but my sense is that what they're trying to do, and they take foreign interference very seriously, is to look at strengthening the criminal code along the lines we discussed early in this conversation, rather than to follow the Australians, their neighbors, in setting up a registry that has been very divisive and very stigmatizing.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I'm just looking at the time and wondering if it's time to bring in the audience. Although we can keep talking amongst ourselves too. Ange, are there any questions yet?
Yes, Megan, I do want to remind attendees that they can use the Q&A button to ask questions at any time. The first question is from Michael Michael says, I agree that there must be stronger distinction between influence and interference. In fact, we host thousands of foreign students in our universities each year. I think this is a very good thing. There is no doubt that our faculty and institutions in general have a great influence on these young people. So concern about influence seems a little disingenuous and anti-international. We run the risk of seeming hypocritical. Are we so concerned about our systems that we don't think we can stand international conversation, even though we educate tens of thousands of foreign students? I guess the question is, what exactly are we afraid of in terms of influence and why we can't handle the conversation?
Would you like me to take a crack at that, Megan? Well, I think you make a very good point. Now, the supporters of the registry would say that it isn't foreign influence writ large that the government is trying to regulate or monitor. It's state-sponsored foreign influence. But even if you narrowed it to state-supported, state-led foreign influence, it becomes very nebulous in the absence of material arrangements between a state and an agent. I'm in favor of a way in which we can track paid representatives of a foreign government whose job is to lobby me, for example. I'm not talking about diplomats now, but if the government of country X hires a consultant to talk to me about a trade agreement, that person should be on the lobbyists registry. And in fact, he or she would be required. So we have this tool already, the lobbyists registry. It's a good tool. I support it. And I'm open to the idea that perhaps we need to strengthen it so that we capture maybe some cases that are in the gray zone right now. But the important thing here is this. We should only capture lobbyists who are in fact have some kind of arrangement with the foreign government. It cannot be that you are a member of an alumni association of a foreign university which is close to the government, and therefore, by implication, you must be influenced by the foreign government, and so you have to register. If we leave it as vague and amorphous as that, theoretically, you could require tens and tens of thousands of Canadians with immigrant backgrounds to register. And that would be very damaging for our society.
Yes, it would be. And in particular, I want to, although the consultation paper wasn't clear on whether or not the registry would be public, it seemed to be suggesting that it should be, so that Canadian society itself can become more resilient to this kind of interference, which really sent shivers down my spine, because what that's kind of implying to me is that we would like Canadians to get used to, checking this registry or looking to see if, an overture, an invitation, or a conversation, or somebody you've met might be in that registry, right? And it's horrible to think that this is like a program that some people right now think is something that's going to be useful for our society, and make us more sophisticated and safe, as opposed to maybe being more paranoid and fearful of one another. So I just keep coming back to that.
You're absolutely right. But Megan, the problem is not just for the people who have to register. It's also for those who don't register but are believed that they should register. So there will be these whisper campaigns when a registry comes out, and there will be all these discussions about Mr. So-and-so, Professor so-and-so, who isn't on the registry but really should be, because we know that he meets regularly with the Consul General of Country X, for example. And this is very corrosive for society, because it will encourage Canadians to, I don't say spy on each other, but to be suspicious of each other. But will it improve our security? Of course it won't, because the people who really are malicious and who have ill intent and whom we really should be worried about, the fellow who assassinated, the Sikh leader in BC, that person, I guarantee you, will not be on the registry. And it will give us this false sense of security that by simply looking at the list that the government has come up, we know where the danger spots are. As long as we avoid them, we'll be all right. On the contrary, it will make us more vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you so much. I guess we can check in with Ange to see if there's another question or comment from the audience.
Yeah, there is a question from an attendee. As you noted, we are in a difficult political moment with great anxiety in the West about China's ascendancy, much as there was great anxiety about the rise of the Soviet Union starting in the 1940s. That anxiety then led to a Cold War policy in the US and Canada, in which national security was allowed to trump human rights and constitutional protections for civil liberties, a period which is seen today as a dark moment in our history. How do we deal with the legitimate concerns about foreign interference without repeating the errors of the McCarthy period?
Yeah, first thing to say is that we should recognize that we are in fact seeing shades of McCarthyism. A lot of people deny that, but to me, there is clear evidence of McCarthyist tendencies and rhetoric in our society, in the US, but also in Canada. And then the solution to addressing the real problem of foreign interference, such as the assassination of Canadian citizens, is to, first of all, define very clearly what we deem to be malign foreign interference, and to see if the tools we have currently are suitable for addressing those problems. I've already mentioned the criminal code. I think that is should be a primary focus of our attention. If it's not strong enough, we should look at strengthening it. Of course, keeping in mind the importance of protection of civil liberties and so on. But that is where we should start. Secondly, in lieu of a registry, I think we should look at strengthening the Lobbyist Act, which already, in fact, covers many of the cases that we've discussed. A bona fide agent relationship with a foreign government would require registry if that person wanted to talk to me, for example. Again, there may be some strengthening of the act that we should do, but the key here is that registration is based on material arrangements, real arrangements between a foreign government and an individual who is paid, compensated to advance that country's views, as opposed to influences which can come from everywhere. That type of registry is not only unhelpful, but it could cause a lot more harm than good.
Yeah. And so to speak more about, how you're acknowledging or recognizing some symptoms of being in like another McCarthy era, and the way that people are perceiving one another. And we're already starting to see, I think, some discomfort around those of us who are questioning this proposal, right? Like, as you said, there's, it's rare, but we're seeing like all party support. There seems to be a lot of consensus that this is the right tool, the right solution, that we need to just jump in head first. But like I say, we're starting to see some demonization and attacks on those who express concern about it, and aren't 100% ready to cheer on this proposal. And we, the center in Penn, Canada, who are sponsoring this event, we've even have gotten some pushback, from people saying that we're just following the same playbook as the Chinese regime, and that you in particular are using anti-racism as a shield to counter to shield any criticism of China's own blatant and banal acts of infiltration and harassment. So, in short, if you're a critic of this proposal, you must obviously be subject to foreign interference already.
And
Or
have
that
to
you're
register.
apologists for it, right?
Yes,
So yeah,
yes.
can you how have you been on the receiving end? Because I mean, I've seen this now just by virtue of being in this conversation today, but I imagine that you've had maybe a broader, deeper experience.
Yeah, what you describe basically exposes the fundamental problem of this registry, because the supporters of the registry, many of them, and I would say we're not talking about people who are nameless trolls on the internet, but people who have, respectable titles and activists and people in public profile have said publicly that I must be by definition an agent of a foreign state if I oppose this registry. And I'm not fazed by it because I have protections and I can brush this off with a certain kind of resignedness. But imagine many other Canadians who don't have my protections, who maybe share the same kind of reservations that I have. They would be subject to the same kind of blanket accusation that your opposition to registry de facto means you are a foreign agent and therefore have to register. This exposes the fundamental danger of the approach that we're heading in. Now, I often get this comment from opponents of my view that when I talk about how there are discriminatory and racist concerns around this registry, how this could be a modern form of Chinese exclusion. Say, well, this is a CCP talking point. What I would say is this. A policy such as the registry may or may not be racist, and we can debate that. If you believe that it isn't racist, you can tell me the ways in which you think it isn't racist, and we can agree to disagree, or we can come to a common viewpoint. But for you to discount the view on the basis that somebody else also holds it, the CCP in this case, is what they call a conversation stopper, right? And it is not only a bad way to advance an argument, but it in fact exposes the problem with the registry, because you have basically put into a certain number of boxes certain views that are by definition unacceptable. And this is what I started with. The new exclusion is not to keep all Chinese people out of the Canada. That will never happen again, fingers crossed. But the new exclusion is to say, here are the different categories of opinions, of viewpoints, of affiliations, of the people you meet, of the events you go to. If you tick any of these boxes, by definition, you're a foreign agent, you have to register.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes that, I completely agree. Yeah, already just the way that the rhetoric is or the conversation. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see where this conversation goes. So, another thing recently that happened was that Justice Hope was announced as the new person
yeah.
who is going to do a public inquiry into this. So my understanding is that I think it's going to be supposed to be done by the end of next year. I think she just started her position this week. What do you think of this? I mean, this might, on the one hand, we might learn more about what's at stake, what are the issues, so that I don't know, I guess maybe the government could craft a great solution. On the other hand, it might just continue with a bit of the panic and frenzy that we've seen in the public discourse about, national security of Canada being at risk because of influence that might be malign interference. So, Yeah, what are your perspectives on the fact that we're going to now see an inquiry? Do you think it's going to slow things down, or is there anything you're hoping to see come out of it or fearful of?
Well, it's taken the heat out of the political debate around the need for a public inquiry, and that's good from the perspective of how the government, parliament, my own institution really should be focusing on many other things that Canadians are concerned about, and not just be squabbling over this public inquiry. So that's a good thing. I keep an open mind on what the inquiry will bring. I wish the commissioner the best of luck, and I trust that she will do the job that's necessary. But we know we are in a fraught environment where the basic mood of suspicion and fear is prevalent. To the extent that she's going to take input from many different sources, we will get a lot of speculative input. We will get a lot of uncorroborated information, similar to what much of the media has been reporting. It's all uncorroborated, leaked information from, presumably from spies. We're going to get a lot of that. And even if she has the wisdom to recognize the weakness of that kind of information, it will be out in the public domain, and it will feed the xenophobia that has been, I think, this is where we started, the source of the spike in anti-Asian racism in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I was trying to find the terms of reference for the Commission of Inquiry. I wasn't able to find it. It might just be that that the Google spiders haven't searched properly. Instead, I found the media reporting on it. But yeah, it's unclear to me too the extent to which the average person will be able to understand this a bit better, just given I mean that was previously why the previous commissioner didn't want to go forward with hearings, is just that how tricky it is to even get at the nature of this problem and to help the public, even Parliament. Parliament, you guys, I think, always are a bit closer to the security agencies, and some of you have the clearance to get some kind of information from the security agencies. But for the average person, it's just unclear how close this commission can get at the truth, given just all that national security, the concerns and the redactions and censorship that is just by virtue of the subject matter going to be involved in this. So
yeah, her terms of reference focus specifically on the two elections, 2019 and 21. It doesn't talk about foreign interference more broadly. That's, in a way, it's a pity, because my own sense is that the bigger story is much beyond the elections. We already have a report from the non-partisan committee of bureaucrats, the so-called CITES team that monitors elections, that the results of both 2019 and 2021 were not affected by foreign. They say there was some kind of foreign interference, but the election results were not interfered with. It's really important for Justice Hoke to tell us very clearly if the elections results were not materially affected, to say that in no uncertain terms, because we already have a narrative in this country that some of the election results in some ridings, politicians have said up to 11 ridings, right? The results may be compromised or may not be legitimate because of foreign interference from China in particular. There's no evidence for this. It's just been asserted. But it's been asserted in such a way that, it really undermines the electoral system, and it insults the voters in those constituencies. Basically says that your vote somehow is not legitimate because you must have been manipulated by somebody. Look, if there's no evidence for that yet, let's just cool our heels and not say that, because it is the kind of rhetoric that undermines confidence in democracy and is a form, I think, is a form of voter suppression.
Yeah, and I mean, we both know already that there's dwindling engagement with our electoral systems. It's devastating every time we have elections, and to see the numbers stay stagnant or drop sometimes, and that young people are so cynical about democracy. Yeah, it's really disappointing how this conversation and about the elections in particular can be impacted, that it might be scaring people off or making them even more cynical than they are. And I think I totally agree with you about the narrow focus then. If it's just about the previous two elections, well, while on the one hand, like you say, it would be great if we could have a definitive report saying that, you know, there was no interference. But on the other hand, it really doesn't get at that other kind of the types of malign interference where communications amongst society and amongst ourselves outside of talking to government or voting in elections, how that might be part of a problem or not part of a problem. And it also makes me think again that if the issue is about elections and interference with elections, then we should, you know, be clear and honest with ourselves if that is the problem, and we should think about tools around the election. So for instance, about elections advertising, we all know, like, the idea about the, you know, the Russians with the election in the US, and a lot of it came down to you know, Facebook ads and all that kind of stuff, right? So we can look at things like that in if we have the specific problem laid out in front of us. But when we have this more nebulous rhetoric going on without being able to pinpoint specifically what the actual problem is that our government is trying to chase and target, then that can allow for
that's a really good point. You know, I hope the justice she will find, I'm almost certain, that there was foreign interference. We've heard from credible sources that there was foreign interference, but as I said, CITES has said it did not materially affect the elections. But what the government has not told us is the nature of the foreign interference in the last two elections. And it's really important that Canadians understand what the government means when they say there was foreign interference. Because, first of all, we can't avoid a problem if we don't know what the problem is, right? So we need to be told. But it also could be, and I don't know this for a fact, but if what our agencies are telling us when they say there was foreign interference is that there were members of the community, perhaps connected to a foreign government, were trying to encourage voter turnout, right, in certain ridings, then let's have a discussion in Canada amongst ourselves about whether, you know, is that good foreign interference? Like, I mean, don't we want more voter turnout? And should I be worried? Should I be worried if in the next election I take part in events in my province where I say to all minority communities, look, you guys are Canadians, we're all Canadians, you should vote. I'm not going to tell you how to vote, but you should get out and vote. Is that going to be seen as a type of foreign interference? So it's important to be specific, and right now, so much of the discussion on foreign interference is unspecified.
Yeah. All right. I wanted to ask Ange, I think there might be some more questions now.
Yeah, there is. The next question is from Ron. Ron asks, says, you mentioned that one alternative to the Foreign Influence Registry is enforcement of the laws already on the books. Are there additional things that Canada can do?
I think education of the public is very important to make them aware of how they could be unwitting tools of foreign states and so on. But this has to be done in a way that is country agnostic, if you will. It's really the broader issue of how we deal with misinformation and disinformation when the sources of information at our disposal are so large, so disparate, and so difficult to control. It's really about civic awareness and savvy, I guess that's the way to put it. But this is not just a problem of foreign misinformation. Again, when I look at my inbox, my email inbox, I get a lot of emails now on, the gun bill and on the criminal reform bill, all the bills that we're dealing with. There's a lot of misinformation there. Okay, as far as I can tell, it's coming from Canadians, and so that is in some ways as problematic as the undefined foreign interference that we've been talking about. So there has to be a broader effort to help Canadians navigate the news environment that we live in, to be critical of all sources of information, to develop a sense of where they can get trusted information, and to not make assumptions about malign sources of information simply because somebody tells you that it is.
Yeah, definitely. Getting those critical thinking skills baked into our citizenry is really, really important for our democracy and to live by our values in our Constitution. And is there another question?
Yeah, there is. The next question, Paul asks, what recommendations do you have for what organizations like the BC Civil Liberties Association and the Center for Free Expression could do to help steer the legitimate concern with foreign interference away from panic and xenophobia toward productive ways of dealing with the problem?
That's a great question. And, the one thing that's really struck me and has worried me is the lack of voices who are raising the concerns that we've just raised this afternoon. The EU is also proposing a foreign influence registry. And as soon as they came out with the idea that they would do this, 230 civil society organizations and NGOs signed a letter saying, we think this is a bad idea. We don't have nearly the same kind of outcry in this country. Kudos to the BC Civil Liberties and kudos to the Center for Free Expression. But we are in a very small minority. And it surprises me because Canada is a country that prides itself on the protection of civil liberties. We have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we hold sacrosanct. And yet there is so little outcry, or not even an outcry, so little questioning of this proposed registry. And I think it has to do with what we discussed earlier on, Megan, which is the overarching mood of fear of national security being given primacy over everything else, xenophobia, and the political context, which has forced many, if not all of our politicians to compete with each other to be more tough on national security, to be more harsh on China, for example, to be more hardline, if you will, in coming up with instant solutions to this issue and this problem of foreign interference. It's just shifted the whole mood in this country such that for us, for anyone to question this registry, you run the risk of being labeled the very thing that that you are trying to avoid. You run the risk of being labeled as a foreign agent. So we need a kind of fresh conversation in this country, and groups in this country that value human rights, that value civil liberties, that value press freedoms, that value the importance of diversity in this country and immigration and multiculturalism, that value internationalism. These are the voices that should think very hard about whether a registry is consistent with what Canada should be.
Yeah, I completely agree that civil society should be joining up, linking forces, and making this an issue and having the conversations, and not just leaving it to the people who think that they're going to be impacted to have to, you know, scream into the abyss, which is something that I so often feel like I'm doing. And I think, you know, to hear about how quickly civil society and the advocacy groups got together in the EU, as you know, really is disappointing for me, again, as somebody in Canada who cares about these issues, and to see how deferential sometimes our people can be to the government, and that we're so trusting sometimes and think that they're always doing what's best for us, is a perennial issue that I come up against as somebody who's a civil liberties and human rights lawyer who BC CLA really depends on like public support. And, you know, and I'm aware and in touch with other civil society organizations, and we're so small. We're always trying to do so much, and we always know that there's more to do. And we're trying to do as much as we can all the time. But yes, I definitely hear you, and I think we need to speak up in relation to that question about what the Center for Free Expression and groups like BC CLA can do. Is I'm aware that this, since it's reared its head, the proposal, we've kind of been playing catch up, really. Because again, there's so many different initiatives right now where our rights are at stake, and that because there aren't as many of us. But I think that we really need to focus and see this danger for what it is. Hopefully now, with a bit of time, like you said, with the inquiry, maybe it's taken it off, it made it less political for the time being. Maybe it's an opportunity for us to join forces and speak out a lot more prominently than we have been.
Well, Meghan, one thing I would say is that some civil society, human rights groups, advocacy groups for international rights and freedoms may be hesitant to resist or to comment on the registry because they feel it might be tantamount to legitimizing the bad acts of foreign states, China, Russia, Iran, name your country. And it's very important that we can separate the two issues. It is not racist to be critical of what's going on in China or in Russia. This is the anniversary of Masih Amani's killing in Iran. It is not inconsistent to be very wary of this foreign influence registry, and at the same time to lament the treatment of women in Iran and to support them in their quest for greater rights and freedoms and protections. There is no inconsistency there. What is really disappointing is when advocates of human rights in other countries would label those of us who are trying to protect Canadian rights as somehow conspirators with the foreign government, agents of the foreign government, and brand us as traitorous, essentially. And I hope we can have the maturity to ally on issues that are of common interest, because, you know, the way in which we conduct ourselves in Canada, right? The way we protect our civil liberties, the way we don't suppress different political views, we don't put people on lists because of who they are and who they meet and what associations they belong to. If we don't avoid those, if we do that, then really we are getting closer to the way authoritarian countries do things. Because, you know, Meghan, you pointed out that the US and Australia and perhaps the UK have these foreign influence registries, but I will point out that Russia also does, Hungary also does, a number of authoritarian states also use exactly this mechanism. And so if we go down this road, maybe we are following the example of the US, but you could well say that we're following the example of some less savory countries as well.
Yes, that's excellent point. So succinct. I think it's great. If there aren't any more questions, I think it's a nice time to invite Jim back into the conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And I really want to thank you, Senator Woo, and you, Meghan McDermott, for a very engaging conversation. I mean, this is a terribly important issue at a critical moment in our history. And I'm really grateful for the commentary and conversation that you had. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today. A copy of the video of this conversation will be posted on our website tomorrow. Our website is cfe.torontomu.ca. As well, we'll post some resources for those of you who listen to this or who watch the video and would like to delve into the issue a bit more, of things you could read or look at. So please go to our website and encourage others to go to our website to have access to those resources as we continue this discussion about it. The next event that the center will be hosting is a very different one. It'll be 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, it'll be on Tuesday, October 3rd at 4 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. And it will focus on artificial intelligence. The question is, what will AI mean for free expression? And we have a panel of people who've thought about that a lot. So I'd invite you to come to that Tuesday, October 3rd at 4 p.m. Thank you again to both of you and to the audience for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Meghan. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.